Thomas Keller and the shadow he cast over Maplewood were supposed to be just another story of a quiet man in a small town, but one hammer one morning, and suddenly the entire community was gripped by fear, their everyday routines shattered in an instant. It was a bright Tuesday morning in the small town of Maplewood, the kind of day when everything feels calm and predictable. The sun shone through the autumn leaves, painting the streets in warm shades of orange and gold. Children walked to school with backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, laughing and chatting with friends. Parents followed behind, some holding coffee cups, others trying to herd toddlers along without spilling anything. Dogs barked in yards, cars hummed quietly along the roads, and for a moment the town seemed perfectly ordinary. That ordinary morning was shattered in the blink of an eye. A man appeared near Maplewood Elementary carrying a large hammer that glinted in the sunlight. He walked slowly, deliberately, scanning the area with wide, restless eyes. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, a tension that set anyone watching on edge. People nearby couldn't immediately tell whether he was lost, confused, or dangerous. Within minutes, parents noticed him and froze in place, unsure of what to do. Children sensed the unease in the adults and instinctively huddled closer to each other. The man lingered near the schoolyard, raising questions that no one could answer. Why was he there? What was his intention? He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't threaten anyone directly. Yet the presence of a man holding a hammer so close to children created an immediate sense of danger. Teachers, realizing the risk, ushered their students inside, locking doors and closing blinds. From inside the classrooms, the children could hear the man's footsteps echoing faintly, the occasional metallic scrape against the pavement, and a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, like he was testing the boundaries of the space around him. Parents called each other frantically, their voices tinged with fear. Text messages spread quickly, describing the man and warning of the potential danger. The news traveled faster than the police, and soon a crowd had gathered at a safe distance, watching the scene unfold with growing anxiety. Some people tried to reason with the man from afar, but he ignored them completely, lost in his own world. Surveillance cameras captured his movements, showing him pacing the playground, circling the perimeter, and occasionally stopping to examine objects as though making mental notes. There was no clear target, no discernible plan, and that uncertainty made the situation even more terrifying. Within minutes, authorities arrived, police cars screeched to a halt, officers jumped out, and a cordon was established to keep people away. The man, however, disappeared almost as quickly as he had appeared. He vanished down a narrow alley behind the school, leaving behind only a lingering sense of dread. Emergency personnel combed the area, ensuring that no one had been hurt, but the fear remained. Teachers tried to reassure the children, and parents tried to calm themselves, but the image of the man with the hammer lingered in everyone's mind. Though no one was physically harmed that morning, the ripple effect of fear spread throughout Maplewood. Conversations were dominated by questions: who was he? Why did he come here, and could it happen again? The calm, routine morning had been irrevocably broken, replaced by a tense awareness that safety could never be taken for granted. What began as a normal day had become the first chapter in a story that would grip the town, a day when an ordinary street became the stage for chaos and the shadow of a hammer-wielding man left a mark that no one could easily forget. As the town of Maplewood tried to process the morning's events, investigators began digging into the life of the man who had caused so much fear. He was soon identified as Thomas Keller, a 37-year-old resident of the town who lived alone in a small, cluttered apartment near the outskirts. At first glance, Keller seemed unremarkable, quiet, solitary, and often keeping to himself, but as police examined his history, a pattern of strange behavior began to emerge. His criminal record was minor, mostly involving petty thefts and vandalism, nothing that suggested a capacity for real danger. Yet neighbors recalled incidents that painted a more troubling picture: long wandering nights in the streets, occasional arguments with himself in public, and an almost compulsive need to break objects in his own home, a private ritual that no one had understood at the time. Officers soon learned that Keller had lived in Maplewood for more than a decade, but he remained on the fringes of the community. He had no close friends, no romantic connections, and no apparent ties to any of the local schools. The fact that he had appeared near the elementary school seemed random, yet investigators suspected it was anything but. They began reviewing his social media activity and found cryptic posts, fragments of thought written in hurried, disjointed sentences. Many referenced a sense of being ignored or overlooked, and some hinted at a desire to make others notice him. While nothing explicitly threatened anyone, the underlying tension in these writings suggested a mind teetering on the edge, a mind that sought validation through increasingly risky actions. Police obtained a search warrant for Keller's apartment and discovered a chaotic collection of notes, sketches, and objects that revealed an obsessive attention to detail. Pages were filled with diagrams of local streets, photographs of schools, and lists of routines followed by children and staff. Some of the notes contained rambling messages about teaching lessons and making people pay attention, which alarmed investigators. Despite the apparent disorder, there was an unsettling method to his madness. Patterns in his sketches suggested careful observation of public spaces, as if he were planning something far more significant than anyone could have imagined. Neighbors described Keller in vague, uneasy terms. Some remembered small, odd interactions, like the way he would watch people through windows for long periods, or how he seemed fascinated by alarms, fences, and gates. Others recalled how he sometimes left messages scribbled on scraps of paper in doorways or attached to public bulletin boards, cryptic notes that no one could fully interpret. These small pieces of information, when pieced together, painted a portrait of a man whose internal world was growing increasingly disconnected from reality. As investigators continued to explore Keller's past, they found incidents from years earlier that, in retrospect, hinted at the potential for escalation. There were reports of confrontations with neighbors over trivial matters, moments of sudden agitation, and minor acts of destruction that had been dismissed as eccentricity. Taken together with his recent actions, a pattern emerged. Keller had been building towards something, a climax that no one saw coming. The town, once confident in its peaceful routine, was now forced to confront the unsettling truth that danger can emerge quietly from someone who had always seemed just a little different, a little off the radar. The deeper the police delved, the more they realized that understanding Keller's mind was like piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces. Each discovery, his notes, his habits, his obsessions revealed a man walking a fine line between harmless eccentricity and unpredictable violence. The question hanging over Maplewood was no longer just who he was, but why he had chosen that particular morning, that particular school, and what, if anything, would come next. Weeks passed after the first incident, and the town of Maplewood tried to return to a sense of normalcy, but unease lingered in the air. Just when residents thought the danger had passed, Thomas Keller resurfaced, this time near a school in the neighboring district of Willow Creek. Reports came in from witnesses who saw him swinging a metal hammer against a fence along the school perimeter. The sharp clang of metal on metal echoed across the empty playground, drawing immediate attention. Students had not yet arrived, but the staff, alerted by passerby, quickly secured the school and called the authorities. When the police arrived, Keller was found pacing along the sidewalk, his movements deliberate and measured. Unlike many cases where a person confronted by law enforcement reacts violently, Keller did not resist. He held the hammer loosely at his side, his eyes darting nervously as officers formed a perimeter around him. There was no yelling, no attempt to flee, just a tense stillness that made the situation even more unnerving. Officers described the scene later as unnervingly calm, almost as if he were waiting for them to act rather than trying to escape or fight. Investigators soon realized that Keller's actions were more calculated than random. Surveillance footage and eyewitness reports suggested that he was testing boundaries, measuring distances, and observing reactions rather than seeking to harm anyone directly. Psychologists who later examined his behavior noted that Keller appeared driven by a need to be noticed, a compulsion to create chaos without crossing the line into outright violence. His actions seemed to serve a purpose only he understood, a dark logic that left others scrambling to make sense of it. The residents of Willow Creek were unnerved by the revelation that someone could induce fear without actually causing injury. Parents shared stories of children who had been frightened merely by seeing him swing the hammer. Teachers spoke of the anxiety that lingered long after the incident, and local authorities realized that traditional security measures were ill-prepared for this type of behavior. Keller had exposed a gap in the way communities responded to threats that were psychological rather than purely physical, highlighting a vulnerability that had been overlooked. In the following days, police began to map Keller's movements across both towns, discovering a disturbing pattern. He appeared near areas of public activity at times when people were most vulnerable: school drop-offs, playground recesses, and quiet streets in the early morning. The precision of his timing suggested careful planning, as though he were conducting a study in human reactions. Officers noted that Keller's behavior mirrored simulations often seen in threat assessments, but with no prior indication that he intended to escalate to actual violence. The escalation revealed a troubling truth: fear itself could be weaponized. Keller's presence, hammer in hand, had the power to disrupt routines, unsettle communities, and force emergency responses without a single direct attack. His actions challenged the authorities, forcing them to rethink their approach. How do you contain someone who thrives on chaos but avoids physical confrontation? How do you protect a community when the threat is psychological and unpredictable? Keller's reappearance marked a turning point in the investigation. What had begun as a random, frightening encounter had evolved into a pattern that could not be ignored. Police intensified their surveillance, psychologists tried to anticipate his next move, and communities braced themselves for the possibility that he might strike again. The lesson was clear: in the world of unpredictable behavior, the absence of physical violence does not mean safety, and the line between observation and danger is far thinner than anyone had imagined. As the investigation into Thomas Keller's behavior deepened, authorities made a discovery that shifted their understanding of the situation entirely. During a thorough search of his apartment, they found a concealed room hidden behind a false wall in the bedroom. Inside, the space was meticulously organized, almost like a small command center. Maps of Maplewood and Willow Creek were pinned across the walls, each annotated with notes about entrances, exits, and surveillance blind spots. Blueprints of local schools, sketches of playgrounds, and photographs of various public spaces filled the room, suggesting an obsession far beyond casual curiosity. There were detailed charts tracking daily routines of children, teachers, and staff members, alongside notes about emergency procedures and response times. What surprised investigators most was the nature of Keller's planning. Despite the disturbing images and the hammer he carried during his public appearances, there was no indication that he intended to physically harm anyone. Experts suggested that his goal was to provoke reactions, to test the systems in place for safety and security. The clang of his hammer against fences, the pacing near school grounds, and the careful observation of adults and children alike all pointed to a desire to study human behavior under stress. Keller seemed fixated on the chaos that fear alone could generate, fascinated by the way people reacted when confronted with a perceived threat. Psychologists who analyzed Keller's notes described him as highly intelligent but socially disconnected, someone whose mind had become absorbed in abstract simulations of danger. He had spent months, perhaps years, studying patterns of human response. Some of his sketches included intricate flowcharts predicting how a school might respond to different scenarios. In his writings, Keller often referred to testing awareness and measuring reaction, indicating that his intent was methodical rather than impulsive. The revelation forced authorities to reconsider their earlier assumptions. Keller was not simply a violent man, but a deeply disturbed individual whose obsession with observation had escalated into public displays of intimidation. The discovery of the hidden room also revealed the meticulousness of Keller's preparation. Every aspect of his activities seemed planned to avoid direct confrontation. He carried the hammer not as a weapon to inflict harm, but as a tool to create noise, draw attention, and evoke fear. There were diagrams showing ideal vantage points for observing reactions, notes on timing visits to coincide with maximum foot traffic, and even lists of escape routes if authorities arrived. The level of foresight indicated that Keller's behavior was far more strategic than anyone had anticipated, blurring the line between planning and paranoia. The town of Maplewood struggled to process this revelation. Residents who had feared for their children were shocked to learn that Keller's intent was not physical harm but psychological disruption. Experts explained that the danger of his actions lay in the unpredictability and the stress they imposed on communities, creating a lingering tension that affected everyone. Schools reviewed their security protocols, adjusting routines to account for the possibility of similar incidents, and parents became hyper-aware of the vulnerability of public spaces. Ultimately, the hidden room revealed a chilling truth. Keller's obsession was not aimed at violence, but at control and observation. The hammer, the public appearances, and the fear he induced were all tools in an intricate experiment of human behavior. His actions underscored a stark reality that the mere presence of threat, even without direct harm, could disrupt lives, manipulate emotions, and challenge the very notion of safety. For Maplewood and Willow Creek, the episode became a lesson in vigilance and a reminder that danger sometimes comes in forms that are difficult to predict or understand. After Thomas Keller was detained, the town of Maplewood began the long process of recovering from the fear and uncertainty he had instilled. Keller was sent for psychiatric evaluation, where specialists assessed his mental state, his compulsions, and the reasoning behind his actions. Reports described a man who was obsessive, socially isolated, and intensely fixated on creating scenarios that would provoke anxiety without directly harming anyone. While his behavior was alarming, it was clear that the danger he posed was largely psychological, a manipulator of fear rather than a traditional physical threat. In the weeks that followed, schools across Maplewood and neighboring districts implemented new safety measures. Security protocols were revised, entrances and exits were monitored more closely, and emergency response drills were conducted with heightened attention to detail. Teachers and staff were trained to identify suspicious behavior and manage crowds in moments of panic. Parents, though relieved that no one had been physically injured, remained vigilant, often arriving early to drop off their children and watching the school grounds with a wary eye. The town's daily routines had changed, shaped by the memory of a single morning that had disrupted the sense of safety they had long taken for granted. Residents talked endlessly about Keller, sharing theories and piecing together the fragments of his behavior. Some focused on his apparent intelligence and the precision of his actions, while others dwelled on the fear he had provoked and the vulnerability it exposed. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, emphasizing the lessons to be learned and highlighting the importance of community awareness. Social media discussions ranged from speculation about Keller's motives to debates about how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Maplewood had become acutely aware that danger could emerge unexpectedly, even from someone who seemed invisible within the community. Though the immediate threat had passed, the psychological impact lingered. Children spoke nervously about the man they had seen near their school, recounting the metallic clang of the hammer and the way he had paced along the fence. Teachers noticed an increase in anxiety among students, some of whom had trouble returning to their normal routines. Parents reinforced conversations about safety, teaching their children to recognize warning signs and remain calm under stress. Maplewood had been forced to confront a difficult truth: fear, once planted, does not dissipate easily, and even a brief encounter with a threatening presence can leave a lasting impression. For Keller, the consequences of his actions were significant. Psychiatric professionals emphasized that his compulsions required ongoing treatment and supervision. The legal system moved carefully, balancing the need for public safety with the recognition that Keller's intent had not been to physically harm. His case became a reference point in discussions about criminal responsibility, mental health, and the unpredictable ways obsession can manifest in public spaces. In the months that followed, Maplewood slowly regained a sense of stability. Life returned to its routines, but the lessons of the hammer-wielding man remained etched in memory. The town learned that safety is fragile, that vigilance is necessary, and that fear can be as disruptive as physical harm. Keller's actions, brief as they were, had created chaos, but they had also prompted reflection, preparedness, and a new awareness of the invisible lines that separate normalcy from disruption. Maplewood had endured a test of its resilience, emerging with a sharper understanding of the vulnerabilities within its community and the importance of remaining alert to the unexpected.